Hello, everybody, and good evening. I'm Virginia Prescott from Georgia Public Broadcasting, and I'm welcoming you to this virtual author talk event from the Atlanta History Center. Tonight, we are talking with Thomas C. Holt about his book, The Movement, The African American Struggle for Civil Rights. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books. There is a link in the chat at the bottom of your screen. You can also link at the Atlanta History Center's website and buy the book from there. Now, we do all know the names of Rosa Parks and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis, Thurgood Marshall. They are giants and heroes of the civil rights movement. Well, Holt's new book, The Movement, challenges the popular narratives that it was charismatic leaders showing the way that drove revolutionary change. He argues that it was the accumulated grievances of ordinary citizens that fueled and sustained the movement. So we're going to dig into that. And as Thomas and I are talking, please do submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and I will try my best to get to as many of them as possible. Now, to introduce our speaker, Thomas C. Holt is Professor Emeritus of African American History at the University of Chicago. His previous books are Children of Fire, A History of African Americans, and The Problem of Race in the 21st Century. Among his distinctions, he's a MacArthur Genius Awardee and former president of the American Historical Association and member of the American Philosophical Society. Tom Holt, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So you begin with two of many women that you write about in this book who were not so well known in the struggle for civil rights, Carrie Fitzgerald and Irene Morgan. I want to start with the first, Carrie Fitzgerald, your maternal grandmother. How did she
Right.
figure into the resistance?
Well, I begin with the story of my grandmother um, uh, because it captures, I think, some of the themes that you just noted that I wanted to explore in the book. That, you know, my grandmother, as I describe in the book, in 1944, early 1944, basically has a kind of Rosa Parks moment where this is in Virginia, she gets on a bus that's going from Lynchburg, Virginia to Danville, her home and my birthplace. And circumstances lead to her taking a seat in the so-called white section of the bus. Um, and as it turned out, for a number of reasons I discuss in the book, uh, she's not arrested like Rosa Parks or some of the other people. But I think her experience was exemplary of that moment in history when, one, the um, the circumstances, historical circumstances, social context was such that she uh, felt, her grievances that had built up over time, that she could, challenge the segregated seating, which was by law in Virginia at that time. Um, and also that uh, although this was something that I think there are undoubtedly other unsung, unrecorded incidents of this sort through this period. We have some sense of that. Uh, it did not lead to a movement at that point, um, although it had all the marks of some of the incidents that would occur in the mid 50s and 60s. But rather, uh, it would be another decade before the kinds of social changes and developments after World War II would enable the broad-based and sustained movement for civil rights that developed from 1955 through the 60s.
Well, I'd like to talk about some of those. Your grandmother was among those, as you said, fed up, but she was also newly conscious of the means and the possibility to act. Now, what
Yeah,
are some of the material changes that made these kind of actions possible at that time in the 1940s?
yeah, yeah. That's the other way in which she's exemplary of the story that I want to tell, because my family had been, uh, like most Black families in the South, overwhelming majority, farmers, either tenant farmers, a few own land, but for the most part, either tenant farmers or sharecroppers, which was a system that actually exercised extraordinary control over every aspect of your life, actually. It was worse in places like Mississippi, but in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, you also had a degree of control of your residence that was part of, the contract, if you will, for working as a tenant or a sharecropper on a farm, your subsistence. And only when that begins to break down, which is a big part of the story I want to tell, does it open up the possibility that individual acts like my grandmother's can become larger collective acts, drawing in hundreds and thousands of people eventually who would challenge the Jim Crow system.
Right. So another note you make in the book to distinguish the rural Southern experience from especially the Northern urban experience, but also the new cities, the new cities of the South,
Absolutely.
the cities of the New South, that urban life exposed fault lines. What do you mean by that? Or what are some of those fault lines that made this movement possible?
Yeah. I mean, it's often less noted that the Great Migration that begins with World War One and accelerates with World War Two, in which thousands of African Americans moved to northern cities, also brought them into southern cities, and the growth of southern cities many southern cities is quite phenomenal during this period. Now that means again the breakdown of the kind of social controls that were true in the rural South on farms as tenants and sharecroppers and so forth. Uh, First of all, residency, is separate. Um, the capacity to build institutions is much greater in the city. Um, and on the one hand, and then on the other hand, to get to work, you needed to, travel by bus for the most part. Most people did not have cars. I mean, my family didn't have a car until, I was almost a teenager. So on the buses, then you get this situation in which the tensions around the segregated system and segregated Jim Crow ideology, have an extra force. And in fact, if you think about it, it reinforces on a daily basis the insult of the Jim Crow regime, the segregated system. And in a way that other aspects of life, did not have the same emotional impact. So much like my grandmother on that bus, and that I described early on, it was just the patent insult of being forced to give up a seat and to move to to surrender it to a white passenger. But other aspects of the segregation system didn't, actually have that kind of in your face, kind of situation. And that happens in cities out of necessity. Both black and white working class folk have to, whether it's getting to work or getting to leisure, getting into town, going to movies, whatever, have to use the buses. And so it's not an accident that's the flashpoint, if you will, that sets off the movement. Not issues about employment, not even issues about voting, all of which are important, but they didn't set off this kind of reaction that happened in the area of public accommodations that were common to cities and that brought black and white into conflict in a very different way than other aspects of the segregated system.
Yeah, that was really illuminating to me that it begins in transportation is that flashpoint. And that also stretches back to Plessy versus Ferguson, that was all about streetcar lines in the 1890s. What are some of the other ways which your book does challenge this notion that the struggle for civil rights began in the mid-20th century? So what are some other precedents and strategies for resistance that did begin in the 19th century and took place in the early parts of the 20th century?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, many of the strategies, techniques, tactics that we see in the 50s and 60s we can trace back to actually before the first full chapter of the book. I begin in New York in 1856, so before the Civil War, where an older lady who's trying to get to church on Sunday is, thrown off what then was horse-drawn cars, and there was a great protest around that. And there were similar protests during the Civil War and after. And the closest parallel to what happened in the 50s, I think one would find in the 1890s, when again, in a number of southern cities, about 26, I think, there were boycotts of streetcar lines. These were horse-drawn streetcars at the time, because of segregated service or no service at all. So there's a long history, but some of those were successful during the Civil War era. Actually, they managed in some cases to achieve, desegregated services. And a civil rights law was passed in 1875 that barred any kind of discrimination in public accommodations of all sorts. But it was overturned by the Supreme Court in 1883. And so then in the 1890s, with the rise of more intense forms of state laws, because often these were not by law segregated, but by the practices of individual enterprises, streetcar companies, etc. By the 1890s, of course, you have it enforced by state law. And it comes directly out of the Plessy decision that seemed to justify or to validate the possibility of separate but equal, of separate or segregated facilities.
Which was, of course, challenged again in the Montgomery bus boycott and the civil rights movement. And you point out that there had been hundreds or more than 100 racial conflicts on buses in Birmingham, Alabama, in the year leading up to Montgomery. So why Montgomery? What did Rosa Parks' refusal to move? Why did that ignite a spark in Montgomery, and why then?
Yeah. I mean, not only there's been a very good study of the bus records in Birmingham, so we know statistically that there were, these hundreds of cases where individuals simply challenged the system. They got arrested, they got thrown off the buses, whatever. It didn't lead to a movement. In Birmingham, and rather in Montgomery, they had been leading up to the famous case of Rosa Parks. There had been a number of cases over the years. Certainly over the past year, there were a number of cases. In fact, there were in which people had been, had faced this kind of discrimination, young and old. And interesting enough, what I also make in the book is that, it's working class women who are often the ones who are protesting and who basically take the lead in challenging these systems, and that's in the record. But in I think it was a constellation of factors in Montgomery. You had again a leadership that had been systematically challenging or trying to find ways of challenging, bringing suits to challenge the segregated buses. On the one hand, well-known Edie Nixon, who was a member of the sleeping car porters, was a railroad porter, but also head of the NAACP for a while in Montgomery, and people like Rosa Parks, who had also been very much engaged for almost a decade in civil rights activity, and had actually counseled one of the young girls who had experienced, the discrimination and had protested it on the buses. So, and as well as the local college, there were a bunch of faculty that were also engaged. So it was a tier um, coalition that was waiting to form around the Wright incident. And the Wright incident turned out to be that evening when Rosa Parks, just trying to get home, not intending to challenge the system, and she was sitting in a seat that was actually set aside for Black people. But the bus, as usual, as often happened, the bus gets crowded, and therefore the Black people have to surrender their seats and move further to the back and maybe stand to give their seats to a white passenger.
Mhm.
And in that context, and also the other factor was that this was only a few months after the Emmett Till murder and his trial, which resulted, of course, in a not guilty verdict, and that was very much on Rosa Parks' mind as well. So a combination then of these factors leads to the possibility of a broad coalition coming together and mobilizing to challenge the system with what became the Montgomery bus boycott, which began, it was going to be, first just a day boycott just to test things out, and then it extended, and of course it lasted almost a year. And it was in that context, of course, that Martin Luther King, who's a recent arrival in Birmingham, and Montgomery rather, um, uh, assumes leadership of that organization, and of course the rest is, as they say, history.
This leads to a couple of different questions that we have from the audience here. The difference in tactics in different cities. The Freedom Rider bus pulled into Albany, Georgia, a couple of years later, where we meet Charles Sherrod, Cordell Reagan. Those are two of the Freedom Riders you introduced us to in the book. Two of hundreds of students who were jailed there for lunch counter sit-ins. And this is where the tactic of jail, no bond, came into play. And so first of all, what was behind that? And what else came out of Albany, Georgia, that movement there? The question
Yeah.
that we have here is, how did the civil rights movement differ in specific parts of the city? So maybe you can help us sort of tease that out, how it played out in Albany as compared to other places.
Yeah, the movement evolved over time, and different tactics, came to the fore: sit-ins and at lunch counters, mass demonstrations in the streets, um, uh, and eventually voter registration campaigns toward the end. Um, the voter registration had always been part of it, but it became much more prominent later on. Actually, in Albany, it wasn't so much that they were Freedom Riders at the time. They were called Freedom Riders by the students because Freedom Riders had gained some fame because of the various incidents of further south, or further west, I guess I should say. But it began as a testing of the public accommodations again at the bus station. Some students got arrested. Those students drew in Charles Sherrod and Cordell Reagan to wanting to protest. And those protests eventually became mass street demonstrations, which had not been part of the repertoire of, there had been street demonstrations actually early in the century, but for the most part, it had not been a part of the repertoire of the movement at that point in time. And that was one of the changes that occurs in Albany. Now, the jail without bail idea gains prominence there. It actually began, one could say it began in a much earlier movement that Bob Rustin was involved in 1947, where they were testing, segregation on the buses, and they were arrested and decided simply to refuse bail on moral principle and just stay in jail until and serve their time. It was picked up again in a demonstration that occurred in Rock Hill, South Carolina. This was shortly before Albany, and Charles Sherrod had been involved in that particular incident. And so then it comes to Albany and becomes one of the principal parts of the strategies or tactics, if you will, of movement action. And the idea is that you have hundreds of people, thousands eventually, in the street, that you overwhelm the capacities of the jails, southern jails, to hold them, and that you create a crisis rather than, being arrested, pay your bill, or or your fine, or whatever the case may be. You simply say, I will not cooperate with an unjust system, and you go to jail instead. And that puts pressure on the local authorities to have to deal with that. And so then that's carried to Birmingham and to other cities subsequently.
So there's another question here about the Albany movement. Christine, I think she's writing a book about the Albany movement, often overlooked in any discussion of the civil rights movement. What impact do you think it had on future marches and demonstrations? And one of the things that you draw out of that is the use of music. Why was singing and marching such an important part of the movement?
I think, well, in the case of Albany, I should back up. There was some music in the movement. In fact, as early as the meetings at Highlander Folk School, where the idea, just before the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was formed in 1960, spring of 1960. We Shall Overcome was one of that. And of course, the labor movement had used, songs in its movement for some time. What happened in Albany is that since the movement was anchored in the church, and it's just natural in the Black church to express oneself through music. And music is, in that context, is a very democratic form, because it is the congregation itself that's speaking and expressing itself. So it sort of reverses the usual or dominant, preacher speaking to the congregation speaking back, and it also brings them together. I mean, it's a powerful effect if one's ever been in that kind of situation, where music knits people together in a common cause in a way that, I don't know, speeches or other things may not have the same effect, because they are expressing themselves, and they are, and it's very inventive. I mean, it's not just singing a set, tune. People add things because related to local events, because, expressing themselves. And so it becomes a very powerful part of the movement. I think especially in demonstrations, it is a form of discipline for the demonstration, at least in my experience. And so it becomes very important there. And out of that Albany movement come the SNCC Freedom Singers, Bernice Reagan, and Jatza Reagan, and some of the other young women who were in the church there, who formed this organization, this group that tours the country and becomes a fundraising mechanism for SNCC. So that's one element of it. But I think the most important element is how it, in fact, shapes the very action and the very, I don't want to say camaraderie, but certainly the sense of togetherness that is necessary to sustain action and discipline.
I want to also encourage Christine. GPB did a podcast production about Albany called Shots in the Back, if you're interested in that, a little bit of local history. But reeling back to that question about how the civil rights movement differed in specific parts of the country. The Freedom Rider that do take off, the Corps-sponsored Freedom Rides that do take off in 1961, things pretty smooth ride. Of course, John Lewis famously beaten up or attacked in South Carolina, but then they get to Alabama and things are different. They're escorted out of town and then arrive in Mississippi. And I'm not sure a lot of people realize that they were jailed in a Mississippi prison for a month. So
Parchman Prison.
so this is like, this is Mississippi. You quote somebody in the book who calls it the American Congo. I think someone
Right,
from the NAACP. So
right.
like, give us some examples of how the Mississippi movement is very specific to place. This isn't a nationwide, one size fits all kind of
Yeah.
approach.
Yeah, I mean, up to that point, what I've described, I think what happens in the movement, what I emphasize were what I call New South cities. That is, the cities where they are like the New South of the 19th century. They are trying to industrialize and to modernize, and which requires outside capital, which requires, um, um, a sense of order that racial violence and so forth, it's cuts against that. The goals of business people and others who want to, maintain racial subordination, but they don't want it, to be, the kind of thing that's happened like to Emmett Till, for example.
Mhm.
So there's a divide then between a place like Birmingham, Montgomery, Greensboro, certainly Nashville, these places, which have those aspirations, and people among the white politicians and ruling class, if you will, who want to sustain segregation, but they want to do it more politely, you might say. And so they were vulnerable to the kinds of movement actions like sit-ins, street marches, things of that sort, which in some sense were especially hitting the consumer side of the economy in those places. I mean, often they were organized at the Christmas or Easter season, precisely in order to put maximum pressure on the economy and thus get concessions. Okay, the Mississippi is a whole different kettle of fish. It's very rural, and especially the places that the movement was most active in. It is still, although it's changing, and changes rapidly actually after or during and after the movement, it is still very much a plantation-based economy, except for places like Mobile and so forth. And so it is a lot of what was being done in a place like Montgomery or Birmingham would be, as tactics, would be irrelevant, really, in that situation, and dangerous. On the other hand, it was with a Black population that was 60% in, say, the Delta, it was a right place to, register people to vote and to be able to put pressure on and to bring about change through the political process. And so that's where the goals in some ways of the movement shift more directly. Not that voting had always been a part of the objective, but it had not been emphasized in the same way that it would be when the movement moved to Mississippi. Mm-hmm. And thanks to the freedom rides, it carried people right into Mississippi. And so they began to try to organize there in various parts of that state and to focus on actually gaining political power, because that made sense in that context.
If you have questions for Tom Holt, please type it into the Q&A. I've got one here from John who says, sounds like you seem to emphasize the decentralized impact of the movement versus more centralized leadership leveraging. Any similarities in the decentralized impact then and the BLM, Black Lives Matter efforts today?
Yeah, I think they're very similar, actually, in many respects. I mean, different times, of course, and different contexts, different folk. But I would argue that part of the strength of the movement was its decentralized aspect, if you will, or leadership. There were a number of organizations, we've mentioned them already, some of them venerable, like the NAACP, some of them more recent formations, like CORE, which was formed during World War II, and some, of course, very recent, like SNCC, or Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, came about in the 1960s. as well as earlier ones like the Urban League and so forth. And each of them, had a contribution to make um, to the larger effort. And sometimes there was conflict among them, but there was also cooperation and a kind of, it may be too strong to say division of labor. It wasn't quite that, but there was a focus in something like the Urban League on, by its name, urban jobs and so forth. NAACP had come to focus mainly on the legal strategy. It had not always been that, but it had come to be that by the 50s and 60s. And of course, SNCC was a very activist in the streets and eventually trying to organize at the grassroots for communities. So, the questioner is right that it was a decentralized thing that comes together at moments of crisis. I mean, it's quite striking that people actually didn't always get along, but at a moment of crisis and with big things in the offing. I mean, the biggest, of course, was the March on Washington in 1963, but other such efforts as well would come together and work collectively in a given locale.
How about where there was tension between them? Taking the tack of legal challenges largely mounted by the NAACP or direct action by SNCC or SCLC or working political channels. These tensions are sort of playing out throughout the movement, at least in your book. So
Yeah.
where are there places or cases where the tensions became very pronounced?
Well, I think probably almost, I don't want to overstate it, but I think almost every instance, at certain moments, there would be sharp tensions over the strategy in a given place at a given moment. Often the NAACP was on one side, for example, especially the national NAACP. And that's the other complication here, is that at the local level, the local organizations actually in Mississippi, in Montgomery, in Birmingham, were actually often quite different. I mean, some of the more radical people in the movement were NAACP leaders in Birmingham or Montgomery, or like I mentioned, Edie Nixon earlier, or in places in Mississippi. So there was a division there between national organization and local as well. Somewhat less so with CORE. And of course, SNCC was not, that was irrelevant, I think, in their case. So even within organizations, there would be differences of emphasis and strategy and tensions at times. I guess the case is.
I was sort of thinking of Stokely Carmichael registering voters in rural Alabama, for example, and taking on a stance that some other people in other organizations may have considered militant, which I think shows some of the evolution of the movement. I'm interested in hearing more about that.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, militant was something that all of them were to some degree. I mean, it was a matter, though, of the shape or form that it took. By the time Stokely was in Lowndes County, this is after the Selma March, the thinking, and certainly among many of the younger people in the movement, after what they'd gone through in Mississippi, and after what they'd experienced with the disappointment of the Mississippi Challenge in 1964 at the Democratic Convention, was a much more focused attention on organizing political power. So voter registration certainly, but also organizing Black political parties, especially in places that there was actually majority Black population, which is in many of the counties of Mississippi, many of the counties of Alabama. And so that caused considerable tension with not only the NAACP, but with members of SCLC, who were militant people, but they did go along with that particular strategy. And so that's where some of the tension at that point, in terms of the changing objectives and modes of organization of the movement, shifted in the mid to late 60s. I guess from about 1966 on, that would be true.
And that is where we first saw the image of a panther, I think, on a flag for one of these organizations, Lowndes County Panthers.
Well, what's ironic about that, of course, people, of course, conflated with the Black Panthers in Oakland, which came somewhat later. But it was simply that, by Alabama law, a political party, organized political party, you needed to have a recognizable symbol. So they could have chosen a rooster, I guess. But it turns out, of course, that the panther, answered people's sense of, of what they were trying to do, and of the fierceness of the panther, and the militancy of the panther, and their determination. And so that's why you get the Black Panther Party organized in Lowndes County as a political party, and then which is quite separate from the Black Panther Party that becomes much more famous in Oakland.
But we do have a question here from Tom. Was there a particular development that led to the Black Power movement?
I would put a great deal of emphasis on the, as I said, the failure of the Mississippi Challenge, and which was the effort to challenge or unseat the all-white delegation from Mississippi to the Democratic Convention in 1964, the convention that nominated Lyndon Johnson for president that summer. And again, this comes just weeks after the killing of the murders of the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. Mm-hmm. So you compound all that with a sense of betrayal by people who were considered friends and allies, who wanted a compromise, who wanted some way of smoothing over, because they were so committed to getting Lyndon Johnson elected president over Barry Goldwater that this seemed worth it to them. And I was say the young people, but it's not just the young people. The people who've been working very hard in Mississippi to bring this challenge about were deeply, I think, hurt and disappointed in the reaction. Again, not just of the party as a whole, but of the people they thought would be on that side. Mm-hmm. And I think that begins to shift so actually it's only a few months after that you get the beginnings of the Selma movement and the Selma March, something like, I guess, 8 or 9 months after. And of course, the formation of the SNCC project in Lowndes County that leads to the Black Panther Party. And then a year later, during the march of James Meredith in Mississippi, after he was shot on his March Against Fear, he called it, Stokely Carmichael has a perfect audience and platform for articulating the idea of Black power as the goal, not integration, not not just equal rights, but power. And so I would date it from that. There were other people who were disillusioned, who I think that's about the time Bob Moses left the movement, for example, for more complex reasons, undoubtedly, but it was a turning point. And a movement that had been really pretty optimistic despite all the the harshness and the and death that it had endured to come to that point, um, and to lose that fight.
Well, there was a real exodus of leaders from the big four movements, those four that helped sponsor the March on Washington or produce the March on Washington in 1963. And we have the Poor People's Campaign that started before Dr. King was assassinated, but that had a march also in Washington in 68.
Yeah.
Didn't get the same kind of level of momentum. And if your argument is that it is not about the charismatic leaders necessarily that carried this movement, why did so much erode after his death? I mean, was it success? They passed the Civil Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act came after that. Is that what happened?
Yeah, well, I think the chronology is a little more complicated there. Between the Selma March, which was a great success, you got a really quite effective Voting Rights Act. Ironically, very much the same as an act that tried to pass in the 19th century in terms of having federal registrars actually go into places and register people. But leave that aside for now. And but after that, there was I guess a number of things. One, it was clear that some of the issues facing Black America were not as amenable to the kinds of movement tactics that we'd seen. To some extent, the terrain shifts to the north, the northern states. So the actions in Chicago and New York and Detroit and so forth. And the problems are deeply economic in the sense of a changing economy. I mean, we look back on it, we see a move from industrial to service economy, which is, picking up pace at that time, the movement of jobs outside of cities. These are structural changes that it's not exactly that it caught people by surprise, because there were people who were analyzing this from the early 60s and late 50s, but it sort of outran the kind of tactics that had come to the fore in the movement as such. And despite the fact you still had street marches and so forth addressing those issues, they didn't have the same effect. And so you witness Martin Luther King's own efforts in Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
which falls after Selma, before the Poor People's March, which was also a case of it was unsuccessful, and I think faced many of the difficulties, complexities of trying to move the needle in terms of social change with the tactics that had been perfected in the movement. By the time you get to the Poor People's Campaign in 1968, this is fully evident, and there are some federal programs that were supposed to be addressing some of these issues. But of course, you also have the Vietnam War, which is competing with those programs, among other things. So it's a very different context than, say, if one had cut into the timeline in 1940s or 1950s, or even in the mid 1960s. So it's hard to say, even if King had lived, whether the march on the Poor People's Campaign, would have succeeded, by what levers or measures it would have been able to make. There have probably been concessions of some sort, but that's an open question, I think.
Well, it's interesting also that in Chicago, Martin Luther King Jr. Dr. King was leading people in a rally and a protest, and they had stones and bricks thrown at them.
Mhm.
But that is not an image that we see repeated a lot. So what was that just simple, northern, we're not gonna, the story's not as interesting in the north, or was it all of those other factors that you were talking about that was robbing attention from the movement?
Well, I would venture what is perhaps a too simple explanation, or at least maybe the beginning define an explanation, which is that the movement up to Selma had really been quite literally a demonstration. That as you show this anachronistic system in the South, um, that to a broader public, national public, including obviously the North and West, that and you mobilize people's support. I mean, and Selma's a perfect example. The overwhelming support across the nation that this cannot stand and that people should be allowed to vote, and therefore you get the pressure, political pressure, to pass the Voting Rights Act.
Hmm.
Um, when you go north and you're attacking, racism in the north and racial, oppression, racial deprivations, uh, then are you going to appeal to who will, exert that pressure? I mean, so you go to Chicago and it's Mayor Daley,
Hmm.
who, very powerful in the Democratic Party. He's not, Stennis or Eastland out of Mississippi. Um, he's somebody that Johnson very much depends on to deliver votes if he's going to be reelected, or anybody else for that matter. And so the geography, I think, shifts the dynamic very dramatically. I think this was recognized at the time that you move to the north, and now your basic tactic of exposing something that is anachronistic and morally evil, but you are finding it there, the place in the north that had formerly provided you some kind of political support,
Hmm.
and so you get people in the street throwing bricks and so forth. I mean, not that they hadn't been, racist and hadn't done things like that before. I mean, they'd done it in the 1940s. I mean, uh, uh, had attacked and people who tried to move into white neighborhoods, for example. But now there's no counterforce that's challenging that to any great extent, and so the dynamic is very different. Um, Now one would have to, it would take some explanation to try to tease that out, but I think that's basically um, the answer to your question. That why it would falter at that point.
Well, thank you for that. Before we close, you write about a lot of hidden figures, so to speak, in the movement, including some of the women of the Mississippi movement. And a question here from Anna: do you think Fannie Lou Hamer has been given the recognition she deserves during the civil rights movement?
Yeah, certainly in the literature on the movement, uh, I mean, the most prominent works on Mississippi or on the movement as a whole have recognized. I think her reputation has grown over time.
Hmm.
In fact, I'm proud to say one of my former students wrote a biography of Fannie Lou Hamer, and her role, her development as an activist, and her role from the 1920s on, and as well as her impact on the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the 60s. But she'd worked in the NAACP, she'd worked in various other organizations, um, and so her place, I think, is certainly of movement activists themselves. They know very well that she was a crucial figure of that older generation. I mean, she was born in 1903. That older generation that helped guide and nurture the younger generation coming of age in the 50s and 60s. Some of the other people may have gotten less attention. I mean, we tend to forget the people who were doing voter education and registration back in the 1940s who were still active, in the 1960s, and they drew on their experience. And these were, important. Stephanie Clark, for example, important figures in the movement. Um, so um, I think that's, a counter argument that they have gotten to some extent their due. My point, though, and again back to my grandmother, is all the people who are unsung,
Mhm.
who don't make the history books, but when you look at who got arrested in Birmingham, who got arrested in Montgomery, who brought the case that in the Montgomery uh, uh, took to the Supreme Court and won the victory over bus segregation in Montgomery. It was about 4 or 5 women who brought that suit, all of whom had gone through a similar experience as Rosa Parks. They are not, household names,
Mhm.
but they are representative of, I think, a broad section of the Black community that was crucial to the movement. The church ladies, you know, uh,
Cook.
I was raised in the Baptist church, so I know these folk.
Mhm.
These church ladies who are behind the scenes and who make it possible, just like they made it possible for the church to work. They made it possible for the movement to work. Um,
We've got a message here from one of your other former students. Her name is Sita Cook, who had the pleasure, she said, of learning from Dr. Cook when he was teaching at Berkeley. Retired from teaching now, volunteering
oh
at
yeah,
Project South. So hello to you. Thanks for the encouragement. But let me pick up on that last point as we close. When you celebrate those who weren't the big towering figures, what does that allow, and what does that tell us about activism going forward, or any future civil rights movements?
I mean, what it tells us is it reinforces the message of Ella Baker and to some extent of Bob Moses. You organize from the bottom up. It is the energy and the sustaining and the power of a movement is in that broad uh, section of the population that basically, like Rosa Parks said about her action that December evening, I've had enough, and that becomes a sustaining way that you keep a movement. Um, uh, you mobilize it, and that it sustains itself to to a great degree, um, and it's not from the top down. And so it's not so much about them being heralded, but of being recognized, and recognized in a way that uh, future movements could learn from that experience. Uh, one of the reasons that motivations for writing this book was that I've taught African American history for more years than I like to admit, um, and over the time, it shifted from students who basically grew up to some extent during the movement during the '60s to those, of course, to whom it's ancient history, and there was this, and I often hear the comment from them that what we need is another Martin Luther King. I said that's exactly the wrong message. I mean, all due respect to Martin Luther King and many of the other leaders who were very important, but that the movement made them, not the other way around. And so, and one needs to recognize that, I think, and in any social movement, any mobilization that might take place now or in the future.
Well, Thomas Holt, thank you so much for speaking with us. Really, really appreciate your time tonight.
Well, thank you.
Got a load of questions that piled in just at the last moment that I did not get to, so I'm very sorry about those. Thomas Holt's new book is called The Movement, The African American Struggle for Civil Rights, and we do encourage you to support your local bookseller, Acapella Books, and purchase the book via the link at the Atlanta History Center website. And thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Please do join us on Wednesday, February 24th. That's next Wednesday, when Bill Gates will be speaking about his new book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, with Kristen Velker. Also coming up on March 4th, Walter Isaacson discussed The Codebreaker, Jennifer Doudna, gene editing, and the future of the human race. There is lots more coming up. You can find a full list of virtual author talks and Zoom links at atlantahistorycenter.com. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.